Hey folks, it's Fernando doing another video for the Modern Survivalist. In this case, I'm going to be going through some of the pros and cons of living in backwoods of north central Idaho. This is something that was specifically posted by someone that lives there in survivalist boards, forums. There's actually a pretty good thread going on regarding specifically the advantages and disadvantages of living in a rural setting or living in a city. The post brings up several good points, so that's why I'm making the video specifically. It says, this is from Chicom, it says, the scoop on the backwoods of north central Idaho. Number one, it is remote rather than rural. There are prepper, conspiracy, anticipators of calamity, chaos, and conflict types, but most are just regular folks. This is an excellent first point, because it gets rid of this idea that everyone living in a certain location, if you live in north central Idaho, you are a prepper or you are a Republican type guy, and if not, if you're living in California, you have to be a liberal Democrat or an artistic type or whatever, lefty leaning. These type of stereotypes really don't help, because at the end of the day, you have all sorts of people living in all sorts of places. You do have a certain demographic that may be tending a little bit more to one side or the other, but whenever you end up moving somewhere, the guy that ends up living next door, unless you specifically know who it is, it may be just anyone. There's no, being all individuals, there's no way of controlling that. You cannot just do an ethnic cleansing of people that you don't like because of their skin color, because of their political affiliation, because of their religion. People, we are all different, and within those differences, you may have people of a background that you believe is stereotyped to be politically inclined, of thinking a certain way, and you may be completely surprised by being the opposite. This, as someone from Latin America, it happens to me a lot. People, some of the more narrow-minded people, I should say, think that everyone from Latin America is Democrat voting illegal immigrant. We're not all illegal immigrants. Some of us are not even American immigrants, so to say. But that's the kind of stereotype that really is not constructive. And specifically here, talking about preparedness and survival, it's not helping you being objective. It already conditions you to think a certain way, and that's not good. Sure, plenty of guns to go around, and more frequent talk of having to stock up because of the current atmosphere. We even have a few Democrats here about. Okay, so you have Democrats as well in Idaho. It's not something that you're gonna be free of, because of course people being all different have different ideologies. People sometimes even change. Some folks that may be more right-leaning end up becoming more left-leaning later on, or left-leaning guys end up voting for Republicans and start becoming more of a center type because they're disenchanted with their political affiliations. It happens all the time. Keep reading here. Traditional, number 2. Established employment is sparse, but there are means to make a living. Great point number 2. The problem of employment. This is something that a lot of people don't really think about, and I get emails from you folks all the time. Many of those emails make reference to folks that ended up moving somewhere because they think it's more adequate for survival, because they've been scared into thinking that you have to live in certain states, and they end up going there. They end up going for a rural living, and they have a few funds until they get back on their feet, and they realize the employment simply isn't there, and the employment that they find is not enough to live to the standards of living that they want. It's not that they are city folk with weird ideas. It's simply that there's not as much employment, and it's usually not as well paying as in larger cities. It's always been the same way. So the issue of employment, of making money, making a living, is very important. Don't just assume that if you have a little bit of funds, you are eventually going to be figuring it out. May take a lot of time until, you may have a small town, a one population town where you have maybe 100 people living in a town. There's the baker, there's the butcher, the gas station employee and whatnot, and you have employment of 100%, right? Now, but you show up in that town and everyone is employed with 100% employment, which sounds fantastic, but given that it's 4 or 5 different jobs available, you're going to be there for quite some time until another opening is available again. So there's more to it than just looking at a few figures and assuming, positively assuming when you're filling the gaps. Okay. The stores and services are limited, but not non-existent. I do food shopping monthly, order off the net, and hunt off my porch. Have to go to town to get mail, and UPS delivers to the general store. Okay, several good points here. Services, it's not that it's non-existent, but they are more limited. Of course, in smaller towns, that happens. In even smaller little towns, rural towns, there's even less of those services. Sometimes they can be a little bit more expensive or quite more expensive, and people end up driving longer distances, commuting more, so as to find better prices. This is a very common story as well. So it is something that you at least have to keep in mind, consider. Maybe it doesn't bother you as much because of your specific lifestyle, but understand that it is what it is in terms of what you have in terms of infrastructure. I do shopping monthly. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that people that end up having to commute and travel back and forth to town a lot end up doing. They try to reduce that as much as possible and make like monthly purchases, or go to town maybe once a week, or even once a month or so. You can hunt off your porch. Well, that's fantastic. That would be definitely one of the nicer things, one of the advantages of living in a rural community or in a rural location. I have to go to town to get my mail, and you can shop online. About shopping online, something that has to be kept in mind. It is an advantage. You know, these days you can live in the backwoods. You can live in a rural location, isolated, a good distance away from the nearest town, and you can still have stuff delivered to your door. Online shopping makes that possible. But here we're talking about something that is very delicate in terms of how this will keep on working during a crisis, during an economic downturn, during a series of events that is crippling and affecting the economy of your state, maybe your entire country. All these things may end up suffering cuts and being reduced. Maybe you're not getting stuff delivered anymore. Maybe it becomes quite more expensive. Depending on where you are, it may not exist anymore at all, and your only option will have to be going to your town. The injured or ill are ambulance or life flighted to county or regional hospitals based on severity. Yes, this is something that my friend Nomad, participating in this thread, brought up a few times about hiring this service so as to be taken with a helicopter if you suffer a serious accident. Well, that's, you know, an option, but this means also that you're not going to be getting the kind of quicker attention that you have in some other places. Right now, where I am right now, 4 minutes. I mean, 3-4 minutes, I have an ambulance here in my door. I've seen it myself when I call them, when I need them. I see my neighbors, how fast it gets here, and I talk with them, and yeah, it is, you know, usually less than 5 minutes. It's 3-4 minutes, something like that. The reason for that is that the ambulance service where it comes from is just a few blocks away from where we are. So that, of course, is a big advantage. Do I suggest that people should live in fear living next to the hospital just in case something happens? Not at all. But it is an important factor to keep in mind and bring to the equation. Sooner or later, we all need medical attention, and even as you grow older, the proximity to hospitals and medical care makes things a lot more easier, and it saves a lot of commuting time. That if you are, as you grow older, maybe even if you're sick, it becomes more of a problem. Have one county deputy and one part-time forest cop. Number 4, there is crime in the woods. Okay, this is something that is being said by someone in the north central backwoods of north central Idaho. Point number 4, there is crime in the woods, he says. Mostly property theft by meth tweakers. Had a murder last year when female tweaker stomped in the head of another female tweaker over an iPhone. So people in Idaho apparently sometimes even kill each other over iPhones. You know, again, going back to point number 1, all sorts of people everywhere. Not common though. All right, yeah, but it does happen. I understand that crime is not as much of a problem in some parts, though you have to be careful about not assuming stuff. If you look at some of the websites where you can see the actual crime rates for the different cities and such, it's quite surprising to see that many times small towns, I'm talking about less than 5,000 population town, sometimes have very high crime rates, and right next to it you have a much bigger city that has lower crime rates, or you have a much larger city with certain neighborhoods that are insanely safe. It's not always that a small town, it's not always that low population means less crime. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. You have to actually look at what's happening specifically in that place. Fortunately, these days you have city data, for example, that has crime by different locations, and you can actually check all this stuff before actually making the move. It's really important to check these facts, this information before doing anything, any drastic move. And especially not assume stuff. When you end up making assumptions, you end up finding unpleasant surprises. Don't live. I mean, try leaving as the less amount of variables possible, and work with data, with facts, not assumptions. Also, the kind of crime sometimes depends on where you are. Meth is being mentioned here. Meth cookers usually prefer isolated places so as to do their business. So it usually ends up happening that in the middle of a national park, you have someone cooking meth or dealing with drugs. Also about property theft. That's a big issue as well. Here in Ireland, you find that crime is not nearly as bad as in other places. But property crime, home breakings and such, here they are happening specifically during the, very, very rarely. I mean, crime is almost nothing in comparison to even the United States. It's much safer here than in the United States. But the very few incidents of break-ins, they happen during holidays, and they happen in isolated residences. Okay, in places where there's no neighbors. Because criminals, of course, choose places where they are secluded, where they are out of the sight of neighbors, and they can work without having someone see what they're doing and calling the cops. In much dangerous places, in Buenos Aires, for example, as an example of something that I do know, crime was everywhere, right? And it didn't matter if they did it in broad daylight with your neighbors going about; they just did it nonetheless. Okay, moving on, trying to keep this a little bit shorter. Winters aren't that bad, 2 to 3 feet usually, but roads are plowed just 6 miles up the forest road from my cabin. At 8,000 feet, there is 15-20 feet over the course of winter, but that's what snowmobiles and snowshoes are for. Nobody is stuck in their cabins all winter. Of course, you learn to live with the weather. You make plans for it, so it's not as if you're going to be getting stuck. But notice about roads being plowed. For plowing roads, you need money. You need a plower, you need someone to work it, and you need to hire someone to do it. You need fuel, you need machinery, you need the actual plower, the vehicle. All this takes money. In an economic downturn, don't be surprised if many roads are neglected in their maintenance, including the plowing during winter time. So all these things, in fact, many of the things that people assume are ideal for disaster or post-world collapse living, most of the things that people assume are ideal for that, it's actually the opposite. Many of these places are viable as a place to live in only because you have all this infrastructure supporting it and making it possible for you to live there. If not, it would be much, much harder than it already is. All right. So it's a very common misconception that assuming that because it works now, it means it's going to be as good or even better after a serious crisis. The farmers on the Camas Prairie to the west are heavily subsidized. This is number 6. Are heavily subsidized to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars each by the government. Okay, subsidized farmers. Right? What happened with the idea of farmers being all self-reliant, salt-of-the-earth people that don't rely on the governments to support them? It's obviously not always the case. You have subsidized farmers. You have farms that would not work, would not remain in business if it were not for the money being pumped in by the government. This idea that farms are ideal places of self-reliance. I mean, we've seen this during the Great Depression, people losing their farms specifically because it's not the answer to all economic hardships, moving to a homestead and starting sort of growing your own food. If it had been that way, none of these folks would have lost their farms during the Great Depression. And as of right now, as it says here by someone from that region specifically, farmers being heavily subsidized up to hundreds of thousands of dollars each. What I do have here is an abundance of natural resources and the luxury of distant seclusion if the infrastructure and services of modern society does fall apart. Well, about the luxury of distant seclusion, it's not a luxury of in case modern society falls apart. I think that's going to be a nasty surprise if, in the unlikely event that that happens, a lot of people are going to be realizing what I'm saying here, that many of these places are viable as a place to live in only because you have all the infrastructure that makes it possible. During a collapse or at least a downturn, all this is going to be suffering a lot. But finally, I do have an appreciation for different ways of living. You know, if you like living in the backwoods, if you enjoy nature and such, and that's the kind of peaceful, quiet life that you do enjoy, absolutely go for it. You don't need me to authorize you, and you sure don't need anyone else to approve or disapprove of your lifestyle. What I'm trying to do with these type of videos is at least reinforce the pros and cons. Know what you're dealing with, know the disadvantages that you should be planning for, and not make assumptions of things being a way that they are not, because you're going to be unpleasantly surprised when things go wrong. Folks, all this kind of method of thinking, of analyzing where you're going to be better off, is stuff that I have covered in Bugging Out and Relocating book, available there below in the link, as well as my other book, The Modern Survival Manual, Surviving the Economic Collapse, where I cover all this stuff and of course much more. Guys, take care, have a great day, see you on our next video.